I just finished a series on the suffering servant of Isaiah for Lent via podcast and my radio show. And throughout those prophecies in Isaiah, we are presented with the prophecy of the suffering servant, the Messiah who would come to suffer and justify through his suffering and redeem his people. And one of the ideas there, of course, is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And we've actually been seeing those readings throughout the readings of the church this Lent, but also in the Psalms, yesterday especially, and the day before. They've Psalm 23, when it talks about how the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, which actually when I was a kid, I used to think that meant I shouldn't want the shepherd. But it's interesting when we talk about this lamb, that from his very first breath, the Lamb of God, Jesus, who would take away the sins of the world, was witnessing to his death, even at his very first breath. And I want to share something with you that is so cool. I call it the Tower of the Flock, and I mentioned it in the last show, but I know that it's not very widely known, so I wanted to kind of share it. It started actually in Genesis, where Rachel and Jacob, there was a place there called, it was actually Bethlehem Ephrath was the original name, but that's where the city of David came to be known. It was Bethlehem. And Jacob buried Rachel there after she died in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. And later, there's a tower there, actually. In Genesis chapter 25, there's a tower there. It's called the Tower of Eder, or the Migdal of Eder. So a Migdal is a tower, and it's like an agricultural, like a stone tower, and the shepherds used it. We'll see further on throughout the scriptures, the shepherds used it to keep watch over their sheep. But in that same area where Rachel was buried, Ruth and Boaz, that's where Ruth was gleaning the wheat, and she and Boaz married there. And then later, as I said, it became known as the city of David because David was anointed there as king. It means the Bethlehem Ephrath means house of bread of fruitfulness. All right. So Joseph and Mary then, who are descendants of David, were in Bethlehem at the time of Jesus's birth, and they were there because of the census. And we have that that prophecy that was actually in Micah chapter 5, where the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. It says, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrath, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from old, from everlasting." And that's why the Pharisees, in the readings last week, that's why they said the Messiah is supposed to come from Bethlehem, not Galilee. And so they denied that Jesus was the Messiah because he was from Galilee. Little did they know, of course, then, that he was actually born in Bethlehem. But in those outlying areas of Bethlehem, which previously were those areas where Rachel was buried and Ruth and Boaz married and David was anointed king, in that area, that became the shepherd's field. And that was in the time of the temple sacrifices. And all of the lambs that were sacrificed in the temple had to be reared and protected and preserved within 5 miles of the temple. That was to make sure that they remained unblemished. And so that field where those sheep were protected and watched over was called the shepherd's field. And that's where the shepherds were keeping watch over their flocks by night, which is the story we see in Luke, where Jesus was born that night in Bethlehem. So that shepherd's field then it has a grand history, right? And it was prophesied that the Messiah would come from that area, from Bethlehem. So if you think about the fact that Mary and Joseph, then there was no room in the inn and they couldn't stay there, what more safe, clean area could you give birth to a baby than in the Tower of Eder, the Tower of the Flock? Because the shepherds, they were actually special shepherds. These shepherds were employed by the temple priests, and they were instructed in how to keep the sheep, the baby lambs, safe and preserved and unblemished for their eventual sacrifice in the temple. And so they had special instruction, these particular shepherds did. And so they would usher in and lead the sheep who were about to give birth into the lower levels of this tower, or this Migdal, the Tower of Eder, in the shepherd's field. And that's where the sheep, the female sheep, would give birth to either a ram, which is a male sheep, or a ewe, which was a female sheep. And so the female sheep lambs were sacrificed for the daily offerings, and the males were reserved for the Thanksgiving offerings. The females, the male lambs were sacrificed for sin offerings, and especially for the Paschal or the Passover lamb. The sacrifice of the Passover lamb was a male, unblemished lamb. And so what better place could Joseph have taken Mary to give birth to Jesus than in that tower? Because it was safe. It was probably cleaner than any of the other areas as far as a manger goes. And remember the announcement that the angel gave the shepherds: you will find the babe wrapped in swaddling cloths and lying in a manger. Now, who else but these shepherds in the shepherd's field would have understood that message? Because when the lambs were born, they wrapped them in swaddling cloths to keep their limbs tightly bound up next to their bodies to keep them safe, so that they wouldn't damage or injure themselves after they were born. And they would give them the time to kind of rest and calm down. And then the mangers were where the lambs were laid after they were born and swaddled. And so the shepherds received that message from the angel, and here they are. They know exactly where to go. They know to go to the tower that's in the shepherd's field, because it was normal for a lamb to be wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger, but not a human baby, right? So they would have known exactly where to go. And it says that they rushed there because they knew that tower, and they understood the significance of that tower. And so my point is then that Jesus, from his very first breath, being born in a manger in the Tower of Eder, the Migdal, or the Tower of the Flock, there in the shepherd's field, the Lamb of God who would take away the sins of the world, even his first breath was a prophecy of the fact that he would give his life as the unblemished male lamb, the Passover lamb, in the future. I think that's so beautiful. I just wanted to share it with you because it's something that I didn't know for a long time, and I learned it recently. So the Tower of the Flock, Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, and there he is being born in a manger, wrapped in swaddling cloths, just like the lambs that would be sacrificed in the temple later.